Now, the 2-year Sudan war has produced the world's biggest humanitarian and displacement crisis. Despite the army's territorial gains across the country and recapture of the capital Khartoum from the paramilitary rapid support forces, the RSF controls almost all of the western Darfur region. So, is Sudan on the brink of a split again? It all began when the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the paramilitary rapid support forces headed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, alias Hemedti, fell out in 2023 over the integration of the RSF into the army. The International Organization for Migration says about 14 million people have been uprooted from their homes, fleeing conflict, sexual violence, floods, and drought. The Sudanese armed forces now controls most of the country's north and east and recently recaptured large swaths of the capital Khartoum and central Sudan. Meanwhile, the paramilitary RSF still controls almost all of the vast Darfur region in western Sudan. And its allies, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North Rebel Group, controls large parts of South Kordofan and Blue Nile State. In February, the Sudanese military leader al-Burhan announced plans to form a technocratic cabinet which would be led by a civilian prime minister and include independent experts when the war ends. Weeks later, the RSF and its allies signed a political charter that aims to create a breakaway government in rebel-controlled areas. But the African Union says it will not recognize the purported parallel government, and the UN warns that it risks partitioning the country. But does it?
So the kind of regions they hold right now, by and large, they are also happen to, coincide with the fact that those are also strongholds in terms of support, as well as geopolitical positioning within the country. And so, on the battleground, the country is already balkanized. But when it comes to administratively, the political future of Sudan is going to be extremely difficult to be able to sustain those kind of lines going forward in ways in which they can actually become viable functioning units like nation states. And so this balkanization we see is also an attempt by the warring parties to hold on to the advantages they have so they can increase, strengthen their hand at the negotiating table to be able to determine the final outcome. But I do not think in their right minds they actually believe that they are going to create nation states out of that, because if it hasn't happened a lot in the last 60 to 70 years of the continent, it's unlikely that it's actually going to start happening in Sudan, even though on the ground, of course, the country is already extremely divided and balkanized, largely along ethnic as well as regional lines.
Well, the RSF political charter also splintered Sudan's largest anti-war coalition known as Takadum. It was formed in 2023 and was led by former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. It included armed movements, political parties, and civil society activists tasked with mediating an end to the conflict. But now some members, now known as TASIS or Foundation, are allied to the RSF, while the rest have formed a smaller anti-war coalition called Summerwood, which means resilience, and there are wider diplomacy gaps.
One thing that is complicating the ability to have a ceasefire and return Sudan to the path of peace is one of the biggest players in international diplomacy, the United States, has been retreating. Europe is distracted by the conflict in Eastern Europe, especially. And the African Union, as well as regional mechanisms, have not been sufficient to be able to ensure that they go beyond just calling for a ceasefire or for parties to come to a negotiating table. Some countries, such as, for instance, Ankara, has tried to offer to mediate some of the dynamics that are afflicting Sudan. However, what is going to be successful is actually all the important players, both continentally as well as internationally, can bring their hands on the deck to ensure that any effort, whether it's by Ankara or by IGAD or by African Union, it is supported by all the important players, because remember, the current conflict is being exacerbated both by regional as well as international actors, either directly through armaments and finances or indirectly through other logistical support or diplomatic cover.
Government data shows the presence of large quantities of gold, iron, copper, zinc, uranium and aluminum in Darfur. While gold mining has long been established in North Darfur, RSF took over control of gold mines in the region in 2017. Control of the mines has been a source of political tension.
Everyone wants a piece of something that is beautiful. And, the extent that there are a number of natural resources that are attracting a number of players, both regionally, locally, as well internationally, of course, complicates, the situation when it comes to attempts at conflict management. Now, that in itself should not be a reason why peace cannot be, attained. And the reason is all parties stand to benefit with peace in actually Sudan and in the Darfur region. Because with peace, then you can peacefully and safely be able to exploit those minerals as well as have access to those resources. But with continued fighting, what you're going to see is the prominence of conflict profiteers, who tend to be very few, who will smuggle the minerals out of the country and use it to perpetuate wherever they want to do that. And so ultimately, I think the entire Darfur region, of course, is not benefiting because of those minerals. The entire Darfur region is going to benefit once it's actually done within the framework of peace as well as stability. At the moment, it's only profiting certain individuals among the warring parties.
But what lessons can be learned from the last split of the country, which happened when South Sudan gained independence in 2011, if the army loses control of the Darfur region?
Of course, Sudan will suffer yet another breakup, which is going to constrain its ability to run, in part because, remember, they already lost South Sudan that was very rich in oil. Losing Darfur will mean now losing another piece. But then that's also going to complicate issues, especially countries such as Chad, that they have cross-border communities. It may actually, instead of solving the conflicts within the theater, it may fan and bring forth new conflicts, because even within Darfur, there are communities which right now, while they may be united against, let's say, Khartoum in certain aspects, absolutely they don't see eye to eye. And of course, we have seen that happen in South Sudan following the split, from Sudan. And so it is not exactly going to be a panacea to the problems of Darfur. Of course, then it's likely also to cost, Khartoum a lot if it were split. But then it may also, bring forth new conflicts, not just within Darfur, but especially the cross-border communities across Chad as well as Sudan.
There's plenty more to come here on Africa Matters, including...
I am Lamek Masina here at Dzaleka refugee camp in Leone district of Malawi, telling you about how authorities here are averting food shortages at the camp.
Aman Masharia in Nairobi. For HIV-positive orphans at Nyumbani Children's Home, a daily pill can make a difference between life and death. But now, a USAID freeze threatens to take that lifeline away.
To Kenya now, where USAID funding has been a vital lifeline for HIV-positive orphans, helping them receive the treatment they need to survive. But now the support is in limbo. A funding freeze has left millions of dollars worth of medication stranded in warehouses, putting vulnerable lives at risk. And Masharia has more from the capital, Nairobi.
For nearly 3 decades, Nyumbani Children's Home has cared for HIV-positive orphans, providing education and life-saving antiretroviral medication to 98 children aged 4 to 16. Among them is Evans, a 10-year-old who dreams of becoming a doctor. Without ARVs, his health will deteriorate. Like many here, he already has lost his parents to HIV.
We were thinking of fundraising in different ways, but where do we get? And this is a lot of money and we need for every day. And right now we are finding it very hard.
Nyumbani has long depended on USAID's ARV program, but with funding frozen, caregivers fear time is running out.
I started imagining us going back to how we used to be, without knowing what their future would be like. You see a child and you wonder about their future. Will they continue their studies? Will they be able to move on in life?
Since 1999, USAID has provided over 16 million to Nyumbani. helping 1.4 million Kenyans access HIV treatment. Now, with all programs suspended, 34 million worth of medical supplies sits in Kenyan warehouses, unable to be distributed, leaving organizations like Nyumbani in crisis.
Poor countries in the world, they are depending on this US aid as well as any other provisions from the first world countries. So we humbly request them, please continue to serve.
The funding freeze affects Kenya's entire health sector. The Global Fund warns millions in sub-Saharan Africa could lose treatment. Mass layoffs of healthcare workers are worsening an already fragile system. For the children here, survival comes in a bottle, a daily pill keeping HIV at bay. But with US funding frozen, this shelf could soon be empty, leaving nearly 100 children vulnerable. For Evans and many others, this isn't just politics, it's sheer survival. And Masharia Africa Matters, Nairobi.
Well, Sierra Leone's exporters to the U.S. are also grappling with the new 10% export duty imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump. Many fear the added cost could kill their businesses, as Suleiman Barry reports from Freetown.
The Queen Elizabeth Water Quay in the capital is Sierra Leone's main port. Hundreds of containers loaded with products like palm oil and smoked fish head to America every year. And in January this year, the country recorded a $6.5 million trade deficit with the United States after exporting $6 million worth of goods while importing nearly double that amount. President Donald Trump says the new 10% tariff aims to cut the trade deficit, but it's putting pressure on businesses here.
Imposing 10% on our export to the US is a little bit challenging, and also it will be difficult a little bit because considering the sort of commodities that we export to the US, and then there is no major exporter. Most of the items that are exported to US are a conglomeration of different exporters coming together to have a container.
The tariff comes as demand for Sierra Leonean products in the US has jumped over 2,000% since January last year, according to data from the Observatory of Economic Complexity. Many exporters fear that new export levies could undo much of that progress. Their concern isn't just about profit margins, it's about whether they can afford to ship goods overseas anymore. While the new US policy poses a major setback, regional trade alliances are emerging as potential lifelines, offering reduced tariffs and smoother access to neighboring West African markets.
In the sub-region, just West Africa, we have a huge market. And we have what we refer to as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and some ECOWAS protocol that has given us farms like ours in Sierra Leone, that has given us a leverage for us to get huge potential in terms of getting more market and share in other West African countries, for which you can take your goods there. The tariff is basically little or nothing. And as a result of that, that alone can serve as an opportunity that we can leverage on.
As Sierra Leone deals with the effect of the new US tariff, exporters face a tough decision on whether to adjust to a more expensive US market or focus on growing regional trade with fewer obstacles. Suleiman Barry, Africa Matters, Freetown.
We head to Malawi's only refugee camp, Dzaleka, which is facing a worsening food crisis. The World Food Programme has cut its monthly cash assistance by half because of a funding shortfall. The UN's food agency warns that with no new funds, the Cash for Food program could stop. Lamek Masina traveled to the camp in Doa district to see what's at stake for thousands of its residents.
Over 57,000 refugees live here. The World Food Programme has long provided them with the cash to buy food. But now the 50% cuts from $17 per person threaten their livelihood. The Malawi government's encampment policy, which prohibits them from being employed or doing business outside the camp is another barrier.
If the WFP doesn't assist the refugees, there'll be a lot of changes in the camp. One, they don't have work. Many doesn't work. Others, they're just saying, we will not see how we shall survive these refugees here in the camp.
The WFP began implementing the 50% cuts in food assistance from February. It says the cuts confirm the seriousness of the funding shortfall it is facing.
Actually, we might be even going further to completely halt the cash assistance in May if we don't receive any further funding.
Authorities say the food shortage crisis could lead to a rise in crime, malnutrition, and desperation. To mitigate the cuts in food assistance, authorities here are encouraging the refugees to grow their own food or start businesses that would help them fill the gap. Without stable funding, even these programs could collapse.
We'll have to look at how we can collaborate with the Malawi government, UNHCR, and other development partners to see what we can do on the livelihood programs. Otherwise, it basically means that the refugees will not have what they are having right now, which is even at 50%.
As part of the solution, the Malawian government says it may review its encampment policy to allow refugees to work outside the camp. But this process could take time.
There has to be a committee that has to be set up to make sure that we consider and discuss on consideration of reopening the reservations that we have.
Among the reservations is that integration of refugees in the community would threaten national security. For now, the World Food Programme is working to secure $10.7 million needed to sustain the refugees from May to December. Lamik Masina, Africa Matters, Lower District, Malawi.
Now, the first direct talks between the Congolese government and M23 rebels set for April the 9th were delayed. Rahul Radhakrishnan traveled to Goma in the east of the country and spoke to some of the survivors of war who say they remain scarred by decades of conflict despite renewed push for peace.
A peace deal is said to be the only prescription to relieve the humanitarian crisis in eastern DRC. But hope, like life-saving medication, is scarce.
We are short of medicines because there is no air transport between Goma and Kinshasa following the closure of Goma Airport. I'm afraid that when stocks run out in the warehouses, there's a risk that healthcare providers will be prevented from treating patients, leading to more deaths.
Hospitals in Goma are still reeling from the unrest. They were overwhelmed by the number of war wounded.
We were at like more than 200, like 30% of over-occupation at some point. The areas that you see here had become a triage zone. We had like tents everywhere in order to accommodate the patients, because this hospital has originally 64 patients for war surgery. We had scaled up to 150, and we had more than 500 at some point.
The fighting has eased in recent weeks, but for many, it hasn't brought any peace of mind.
People say that the war doesn't want to end in our country. Before, many wars were fueled by ethnic conflicts, but the one in which I was wounded was a war of aggression.
Civilians are often the first casualties of war. The UN says at least 3,000 people were killed since January. But that number reportedly cites data from the Congolese government and is widely disputed. M23 says a vast majority of those killed were combatants from the Congolese army. We can't verify either of these claims. Even for aid workers and humanitarians over here, it's been really hard to keep track of the number of killed and wounded. But many of them in their 20s, 30s, 40s, keep trickling into a war casualty hospital like this one. But they're too afraid to admit their role in this conflict. They fear reprisal from the new authorities in town. But who's who among the wounded doesn't affect the work of medical professionals.
There were some combatants among the patients that we received, but most of them were civilians, and because we have a lot of women and children, so we did not, really insist on the status of the patients. We take care of everyone.
The UN says many male patients, suspected to be combatants, were nabbed from their hospital beds in armed raids. Wars are unforgiving, and in the DRC, they're filled with contradictions and misery. For many survivors, it paints a bleak picture for the future.
What hurts me is to see that many of the people who have been wounded in this war are young people like me. Some are older than me, some younger. I wonder if I'll be able to achieve what I planned in life after losing my leg.
Burying the complexities of this conflict to reach a peace deal hasn't worked in the past. Its grave consequences may still persist in the region, despite mediation efforts to end the war. Rahul Radhakrishnan, Africa Matters, Goma, Democratic Republic of the Congo.
And finally, we head to South Africa, which is using beetles to remove an invasive plant that grows on water and threatens aquatic life, using an unusual approach that's been successful in the US. Rupert Stone has more.
This may look like a grassy field, but it is in fact one of South Africa's dams. The green expanse is Salvinia, an invasive plant that grows with remarkable speed on water.
I would imagine because the quality of the water is so bad that it's pure fertilizer for these invasive species. And so what really happens is it seems to have the effect of it seems to double its mass in about 2 to 4 days, which is absolutely insane.
The Salvinia is highly destructive, damaging underwater life.
This plant and other invasives like it block out the sunlight. If they block out the sunlight into the water body, there can be no oxygen in that water body because the plants in that water body won't be creating oxygen through photosynthesis. If there's no oxygen, there's no fish, there's no crabs, there's no insects, and so you completely destroy or alter the aquatic ecosystem.
Professor Kurtzi is leading an effort to combat the Salvinia using weevils, a type of beetle imported from Louisiana in the United States. The weevils eat away at the Salvinia, removing it through purely natural processes. This was already tried with great success in the American state of Florida. Now a similar project is being replicated in South Africa, and it could take some time to get results.
We obviously have to allow the biological process to take its course because this is largely, a process of attempting really through this particular process to deal and address the issue of the alien invasive species. So I'll take Prof. Julie's cue on that and say in about a year's time we should be able to start seeing some form of difference.
Given the scale of the problem, locals are clearly in no mood to wait. But they have no choice but to let nature take its course. Rupert Stone, Africa Matters.
That's our show this week. Share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode or ideas on what you'd like us to cover on YouTube or on X using the hashtag Africa Matters. Thanks for watching, and it's goodbye from me, Grace Korea Kanja.